Well, welcome everybody. It's so nice to see so many of you on this occasion. And I'm Helen Haste, and I'm one of the organisers of this event, so I'll introduce people. This, as you know, is a CMEI seminar, a Civic Moral Education Initiative. And I'd like to see so many of you from probably all over the university and outside, and other universities, and from local organisations as well. Could I ask you, please, before you go, to sign this sheet? Add your email address if you'd like. So we'd like to know who's come, and if you're not on our mailing list, your email will make sure that you are put on our mailing list. But it'd be very helpful if you could sign this at some point, so we'll start passing it round. We have a very distinguished group of people today, who I'll introduce shortly. Now, the event is a discussion around provocative questions in the area of civic engagement and civic education, an area which we're all very concerned about. But we're also using it to forefront a book that came out last summer, which was the Handbook of Research on Civic Handbook of Research on Civic Engagement in Youth. Anyone should buy them. It's
only $110.
Well,
It's only 90 and it's only 85 on
anyway, one of our distinguished guests, Judith on the first one of the editors, introduced the book. So we'll start off by talking a little bit about the book, which I said we hope you'll all rush out and buy, but certainly not read in the library. And then we'll be opening you up to discussion about the various provocative questions that we've brought together for today's discussion. The moderator very kindly has taken on the difficult job of controlling us, is Rick Wyler, who is a member of the faculty here at the Ed School. So he'll be controlling us. So we can get more chairs at this point. There are actually still some seats around, so please find some seats. So I will start by introducing people, then I'll hand over to Rick, who will, as it were, deal with the proceedings. Well, I've introduced myself. I'm Helen Haste. I'm on the faculty here. I'm one of the people who's involved in organising the CMEI programme. Just to bring in the other two people who are really involved in the CMEI programme, Mary Levinson, who's on faculty here also, and she was actually the initiator of the CMEI about 3 years ago now, wasn't it? And we're very grateful that she got it off the ground. It's been a very important community. The other person involved in organising is Bob Selman, again on the faculty here, and he's taken a lot of responsibility also for it. Additionally, we have from the faculty, we have Fernando Reimers, who I think is it Reimers or Reimers? I should know that. Right. Fernando Reimers, who is on the faculty here and very involved in research, particularly in Latin American countries and in policy. We have Janet Kwok, who is a doctoral student, who worked with Bob on his chapter in the handbook, who's doing some very interesting work in civic engagement. And our two visitors from elsewhere are Peter Levine or Levine?
It doesn't matter, but just to be cute with him, but it's actually Levine.
Levine. Peter Levine, who is the director of Circle, which is at Tufts University, which stands for the Centre for Information Research on Civic Learning and Engagement. Right? Sure. We're delighted to have him. And finally, Judith Tolipeta, who is from the University of Maryland, who was one of the editors of the handbook and has an extremely distinguished career, particularly associated, but not only, particularly with the founding of the IEA 28-nation study on civic education worldwide, a major, major contribution to our understanding of education and internationalism. And Judith is the recipient of a large number of very distinguished awards as a consequence of an absolutely outstanding career. We're delighted that she was able to come from Maryland, where she's Professor of Human Development today, to join us and to introduce the handbook. So I'll pass over to Rick to take over responsibility.
Is Judith introducing the handbook first?
Yes, you're
Okay.
you're in charge.
I've been told I have 4 minutes, so it's
Well, let me just first welcome everyone. It's great to see everyone. I'm starting to play fantasy basketball. I've been struggling to put together my fantasy basketball team, but here I have my fantasy civic education team. So, it is an honor to be doing this. And let me just tell you a little about the format. Judith is going to start. Then we are going to have 5 questions, and I'm going to ask three of the panelists, and this was all determined beforehand, to answer each of these questions. So let me start with Judith.
Thank you very much. Helen and I have known each other for something nearing 30 years. We just figured today, and actually, civic engagement under various guises has been around for a little longer than that. When I was a doctoral student at the University of Chicago in 1960, John Kennedy was elected, of course, and two professors there got a grant to study political socialization. One was a political scientist, David Easton, and the other was a psychologist called Robert Hess. They needed a research assistant, and the pay was wonderful in those days, $125 a month. And so I took on this job. And all these years later, I'm still doing it, and the field has certainly had its ebbs and flows in the meantime. In the first place, it went from being primarily something called political socialization, which both political scientists, in fact, quite a lot of political scientists in the 1970s studied. Lots of dissertations on this subject. Find your local elementary school, go out and ask them a few survey questions about what they think about politics, and there you have your dissertation. And then we got into adding education into this mix. Certainly when IEA, the International Association for the Evaluation of Educational Achievement, did its first study, which I was part of in the 1970s. Again, having kind of lurched into this, my supervisor, my PhD supervisor, couldn't go, so he asked me if I wanted to go, and I did. And so that's when I started working with IEA in a study in 9 countries. And so education and knowledge questions became added at that point, and then a bit later we added volunteering and service learning. And so a kind of umbrella these days that we decided to put together in this handbook is civic engagement. The co-authors with me were Lonnie Sherrod, who was at Fordham University, is now the executive director of SRCD, and a very visionary guy who was for a while the vice president of the W.T. Grant Foundation. And I was the kind of the detail-oriented person. He was reminding me I did all the line editing on all the chapters in here. And so that was partly my function, producing as many rainbow colors of changes in one kind and another. But you have to realize how far this has come, and that's the reason that Lonnie decided to organize, also Tommy Fines in Wisconsin, to do this book, because we were all, in one period or another of our lives, Tommy and Lonnie as well as myself, frustrated by the fact that there was interest expressed here and there, but no kind of coalescing of anybody around any sort of major initiative. And then, thanks in part to Bill Galston and Peter and other people I don't have the time to name, plus some changes in psychology with a move toward actually recognizing that young people have attitudes that might count for something rather than just being sort of sitting back there and totally unconcerned about these matters. We got some more theories. I was cleaning out my files the other day and came across some references. There was a time when Hans Furth, who was Piaget to study political attitudes, was one of the few theories that was around. And so we've come a long way from there. The whole movement toward lifespan psychology and toward positive approaches to psychology was important here. It used to be adolescents' textbooks were full of drug use, pregnancy, all these things that might befall your adolescent rather than anything that they might be actively involved in. So we put together the handbook with help from the W.T. Grant Foundation in a series of meetings, and that was in some ways, I know Peter was at many of these meetings, one of the most exciting parts of doing it, was sitting down and saying, now what belongs here, and who can we get, who do we know that can do this? Some chapters started very early. Peter's was one of them, certainly because it was very foundation. What are the models that lie behind these kinds of programs of one kind and another? I was insistent, whenever possible, to have interdisciplinary work, and so there was a political scientist who's a co-author with me on my chapter, for example, and several of the other chapters are likewise. We wanted an international presence, and Fernando and others joined us for much of that. So I can't mention everybody who was involved in this, but I will say it was, I think, an experience that, and I hope that will shape research in the field. I mean, some of the people, I think, learned what it means to write a research chapter, because we're all used to writing other things. We write articles, we write argumentative chapters of one kind or another. But this was intended to be a volume which people search out when they want to do research. What's been done? What are the methods that have been done? What are the problems that haven't been addressed? So I hope that
Great.
certainly is
Great, thank you very much. So our first question, and it is a question for Peter and for Bob and for Judith, is recent books, including the handbook, have tried to address the question, what is civic engagement? What gaps do we still see in the definition and topics covered? And would one of you like to launch us?
Well, I thought he was first, but he doesn't want to go first.
Go ahead. Peter, you want to go first?
Yeah, sure.
Great,
I
thank
feel
you.
like this is like a presidential primary debate.
I know, I like it.
Red meat to the face and then the front runner. Were you flipping up the questions?
Julia,
It's there. If you click PowerPoint on the bottom, it's
But
right there.
while you're working on that, I think the question has to do with kind of what are we missing in our list of outcomes, right? Of civic, yeah.
What gaps do we still see in the definition and
In the
topics?
definition,
Yeah.
And
no,
well, I mean, I think
that's the first one.
there we go. I think others may disagree, but I feel like our lists actually of the things we're looking for have gotten very long. And they consist of many, many different discrete sort of civic acts, like not just voting and volunteering, but posting things on your Facebook page or strikes or just an enormous list of things. And the kind of psychological characteristics or traits or virtues are also very involved. And so probably what we need is not, I don't think we're missing so many things. There aren't so many gaps, but we need a little more conceptual clarity. And, we're not going to reach consensus on the conceptual clarity because that would be a bit disturbing because it should be a controversial topic area. But each person should be internally, conceptually a little clearer. So, there's just a couple of quick examples. We count sitting down in Tahrir Square in Cairo as civil disobedience, which is civic engagement. But we don't count, and I personally probably wouldn't count resistance to authority in a regular American school, sort of refusal to comply as civic engagement, even though it has a similar attitude towards the institution. Or everybody counts joining TFA, Teach for America, as civic engagement because it's an AmeriCorps program and that's service. Some people, a fair number of people, will count being a full-time classroom teacher or heading in that direction as civic engagement, which I'm fine with, but we should think about it. And then if you write textbooks for Houghton Mifflin, why shouldn't that count since you're also contributing with your for-profit firm? So, and I could go on, but I think at some level you need to have something below your list, and I'm not sure that we all do yet.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Bob?
Thank you. First, I just want to say I am shocked to see so many people here. I would not have predicted this, and I don't know whether other on the faculty were. It's just great. But it reminds me, I'll tell you, I had a free association for this, which was it's a graduation. There's a ceremony, and many of you will participate in late May, which is graduation. It'll be an hour-long procession. And I don't know about the rest of the faculty, but I'm one of those faculty who recognizes hardly anybody. It just reminds me what a relatively big world there is at GSE relative to how many students each of us as a faculty member sees. Now, there's a purpose to this, and that is that I don't recognize a lot of you. And so what I'm going to say may sound provocative to some of you. I'm one of those folks who comes out of human development as a discipline, who thinks that you can actually think of a civic engagement on some scale of less engaged to more engaged, which is not just a quantitative measure, but is actually qualitative. Okay? But in terms of the general question, I think it's very hard, as Peter said, to define this kind of construct. There were two scholars of the past who influenced the way I would go about doing this. I want to tell you, this is talking to some of you who are not converted. One was Piaget. Judith made reference to Hans Furth, one of the first Piagetians in this country. And he said, if you wanted to understand something, watch how children's ideas about it develop. And I think that is a pretty good idea. Okay. The other guy was Yuri Bronfenbrenner, who was also a developmental psychologist at Cornell. And he said, if you want to understand something, try to change it. Okay? And I think those are the kind of things we need to be doing. Now, in our chapter, Janet and mine, and what Judith didn't mention, which I will, is the other kind of theme of our book was to bring in young scholars. The espoused reason was because we would bring them into the field. The real reason was that they were smarter than we are, and therefore the chapter would be qualitatively better. So Janet and I have worked on a kind of third gap, which is if you really want to understand what civic engagement is, try to measure it. Okay, and that means try to measure it up front in terms of trying to define it through ways to clarify what are the qualities that generate more adequate civic engagement. And I think I'll stop. I won't go further on that now because I think some of the other questions will raise that too. And then, of course, you just need to absolutely have some kind of measurement at the back end, because if you're going to be trying to promote civic engagement, you have to have a way to define what better civic engagement is when you're trying to assess interventions. So I'll stop there.
Great. Sure.
I wanted to talk about the way I see a dimension of the book and wonder about sometime if we could have been any more full in our consideration if we dealt with it, and that's the social justice dimension. It doesn't appear explicitly very often in the book, and yet it's the term that everybody is throwing around these days a lot. And this is over there, and she and I have been involved in human rights education for a long time. There are others of you who've done this in other ways, and I'm hoping with this now. Helen mentioned the IA civic education study. When I was putting that together in a very collaborative format with people from 28 countries, one of the things that I really wanted to do and succeeded in doing was getting a lot of material in there that a lot of people wouldn't recognize as education, a lot of attitudinal material, because that's what I was interested in, is attitude development, not just knowledge. And they've done the civic education study again now, and they've gone back to mainly knowledge, and I find it much less interesting for that reason. But among the attitude measures we have are attitudes toward immigrants' rights, and we put this in 1999, and heaven knows this has become a much more interesting and important measure in the time. And we're now finishing an HLM study of school and national context in relation to support for immigrant rights, which is extremely interesting. And what is interesting about the book, though, is that we have two chapters on the experience of immigrants with political matters. But we don't really have anything in the book about how attitudes toward immigrants or other groups develop. Now, I know there are lots and lots of handbooks these days about prejudice and discrimination. You name it, I could probably find 5 in your library within the last 5 years. But this was a dimension we did not put here. And it's one of the ones that I kind of wish we had, because I think it's an important dimension. And the other one is, and I think this may surprise some people, service learning isn't even in the index. And yet many people would say civic engagement, well, of course, that's what that means. And yet I think that was in part intentional. We didn't want to have a whole lot about it explicitly, but as a result, we have almost nothing about it explicitly. And so I think some people may think this is false advertising or something in the sense that it's not.
Right. Let me just ask one quick follow-up, and it's mainly for you, Peter, I think. I I resonated with what Bob said about needing to have some definition of civic engagement that's meaningful so we can assess it and we can have a meaningful public conversation about it and know how it's improved. And you all have been very thoughtful about the difficulties in defining it, but I wonder if you sort of land somewhere with this in terms of how you conceptualize it, or for any of you.
Yeah. I mean, I probably do, although if we got to measurement, the question would be, could you do it in a way that's context independent? Because I think, to be a good citizen in the People's Republic of China right now is very different from Dorchester, which is very different from Harvard. But so if you probably can have one definition that would take you upstream, but I don't know if it would yield a set of measures. Anyway, the heart of the definition for me would probably have to do with, with two pieces. One would be acts and virtues which can contribute to improving the polity, or the political order, broadly speaking. And secondly, acts and traits which contribute to improving the commons, which are the things that are sort of unowned or collectively owned, which may not be controlled by the polity. But then that, in certain circumstances, that means that maintenance of decent political institutions is your primary duty. In other situations, it may be the destruction of the political order is your primary duty. So the question of how you get to measures seems to be challenging, although I don't think it's so challenging within a particular regime.
Well, just to build on what Judith said in relation to that, I actually didn't realize that there was not any kind of emphasis or strong emphasis on service learning, because it was such a dominant feature of the field over the past 10 years. And I think for those of you, I think I'm reading this right in a kind of sound bite. The findings were essentially in that field that you can't just send people out to do service learning without having some kind of reflection, and vice versa. You can't just talk about things without having them go out. So I think that suggests, and I guess this is a plug for my chapter. I won't go into it, but if we sort of read the chapter, it's the last chapter in the book. I think that has been but it talks about informed social reflection. And I guess the quest in that chapter is actually to claim you can get universal dimensions of informed civic understanding that then would translate somehow into some civic engagement, at the same time as you have to pay attention to the kind of particularities. So I only partially agree with what you say, and I think that stance is not so controversial in human development, but I suspect it's highly controversial in other parts of the school here.
Yeah. So, question number 2.
Just on the screen again.
Back on?
That's the next one.
Very civic of all of you. Thank you. Okay.
That's the previous one.
I'm going to let you do it. Here's the good.
But aim it at something that it will respond to. If you aim it at the screen. No, it won't respond if you aim it at the screen. You have to aim it at some kind of instrument.
I'm going to read this, and we're going to keep going while we figure this out. This next question.
Just want to get off of that?
We want to go to the next question.
Let's go to the next.
There we go. Thank you.
Right.
Thank you. So this question is for Mira and Janet and for Helen. And the question is, are increasingly disempowered teachers able to teach students how to become politically empowered, however good the curricula? And Mira, will you start?
Yeah, so I should say, I don't remember if I actually suggested this question.
Yes, you did.
I did, okay.
Yes,
that's why I'm
In a more
answering it.
provocative
That's why you're
form.
first.
I think
That's why I'm first.
we watered it down.
And I should say, I think we don't actually know, but I have some intuitions about it. So I mean, I think this is actually a thing that is really, really ripe for people to figure out. So it would be a great research project. So my sense is that I've spent a long time wondering why it is that civic education is so lousy in this country. And there are clearly a lot of reasons for this, but I suspect that one reason is that it's very hard to teach well what you yourself don't know how to do well, and or what you yourself don't actually believe in. And in general, our country is not actually great at civic and political engagement and participation. So there's no reason to think that teachers are uniformly going to be better at that than others. And that's not really how we select or train teachers. So we certainly do not select and train teachers. There are very, very few programs that select and train teachers across the board on the basis of, say, their civic and political engagement. We do select teachers, or prospective teachers select themselves because they love children and they want to make things better. That's great. That's not the same as civic and political engagement. And to the extent that programs do any sort of actual professional development with training of working with teachers on this, it tends to be history and social studies teachers. And some of those have selected themselves because they're civically and politically engaged. And many of them haven't. They've selected themselves because they love history or economics, or because that's what there was a job market, or because they were recruited to be a coach in the past, or, there are many, many reasons that people become teachers. But so already we have no good reason to think that teachers are certainly any more engaged or more empowered. And this is, again, totally speculative. Building off of my 8 years teaching in public school systems, particularly in two large urban public school systems, it's a very disempowering experience. So you get, as a teacher in public schools, you very often are handed things to do, right? And your voice is virtually nil. You are utterly at the whim of, you serve at the whim of your principal if you're untenured, or in fact not of your principal. I had the experience 4 years in a row, 5 years in a row, something of being fired, even post-tenure, because first of all, I was first in, so first out. Nobody wanted me to go, but but legally, the way the union contract used to work in Boston, I automatically sort of lost my job my first year, and anybody with greater seniority could have taken it. And it was only because of various shenanigans that nobody did take it. So I got, to stay for the second year. And then even once I was tenured, because, we see this in Providence now, right? The entire district getting fired. There's a lot of, you're at other people's whims for what you teach, how you're expected to run your classroom, etc. And so I think it's especially disempowering in relation to government body. You are at the mercy, you're at the direct mercy of the state. And you are watching state control your lives and the lives of your kids, often in ways that are not very salutary. So I suspect that, in fact, teachers are less empowered and get less good civic training as adults than others because they have this experience of being sort of tamped down by the hand of the state. And so I think it's very hard then to teach really empowering curricula and really empowering, actions, because it's very hard to believe that, people can make a difference. And I also think that in the United States, at least, we have an ethos of individualism and an idea of the individual as a civic actor that also then makes it especially hard to teach, because as an individual teacher, the experiences of being, squashed, and the ways in which one could actually imagine a way out of that predicament is, I think, through collective action that we don't really think in the United States of as being the model of civic engagement that we teach. But I should say this was entirely speculative. I can say that there is no good research out there about this, so I don't think there's anybody who could contradict me on this, but we really need some good research on this.
Great. Janet.
I'm interested in the issue of context and also small acts, because, as Nurse pointed out, there is a major crisis with the way teachers are being treated. But also on a larger level, we are all disempowered to some extent. If you think about it, one of my friends was going to clerk for the Supreme Court, so I asked him if I could write an amicus brief when I got my EDD, thinking that this would somehow make me more qualified. And he's like, no, you have to have a JD, you have to do this, this, and this. So I mean, obviously at some levels, we are just not going to be empowered. I think that this is important to remember, and I think that despite teachers' disempowerment, I also think that's a strength in being able to relate to students who are even more disempowered, because, you know, you're a minor, your parents are telling you what to do. You have to attend school, and you're being oppressed by the same school that's oppressing your teacher. The state is controlling all of you, and you're all in it together. So this is where I think that if a teacher can find a way for him or herself to believe that there is change possible at their own level, then that's a good place to start. This is very idealistic in itself, because I remember I went to your discussion recently where you mentioned the crisis of bathrooms in public schools, and the sorry condition of them is a reflection of how the school treats you and views you as a student. So it's the same thing. I mean, if as a teacher you can find just one small thing to show your students that they can work on, then that is your civic engagement. That is what's possible for you. I mean, and in the larger role of the government, I mean, with lobbyists and, you know, all kinds of things going on at other levels that we don't know about or we don't have access to, we do our best. Like, we go and vote because that's the very least we can do, and that's why it's such a big deal to vote. That's why they want you to have the voting sticker, is to know that other people are doing it, which is an issue that I think I'm commenting on in a subsequent question. So, since I'm inspired by Bob, who brought in 2 quotes, then I have one from Andy Warhol, which is appropriate. He says, they say time changes things, but you actually have to change them yourself. So my question is, what things? What things can you change? Because you have to start at a level that you can access and believe in before you get to the other ones that may not be available to you right now.
Great, excellent. Helen.
Yes, well, I think although I agree with Mira's point about and Janet's point about the problem of disempowerment of teachers, particularly in this country, but in many countries, because they are servants of the state, and the state can be remarkably oppressive in even the most democratic society for all kinds of reasons. But I think that underneath this question is something else, which is the question about what actually gets people empowered in the first place. Now, implicit in what Mira is saying is the idea that if we are empowered, we can empower others. Yes. But in fact, when you look at social change, you look at this, if you want to understand it, change it model, which was he mentioned, and you actually look what happens in social movements, indeed, in a sense, the later question picks this up as well. The people who actually start doing things are often those who are in one context or other, the most oppressed. I mean, you wouldn't ever get any social change, any kind of, let alone revolutions, if the people who are oppressed and disempowered didn't actually do something about it. So I think the argument that just because teachers or any particular group are disempowered, therefore they're not in a position to empower others or to help others be empowered, I think that's historically incorrect. And even though it's, in a sense, also valid in certain contexts. I think we need to think about what is the nature of this empowerment, and would it necessarily disempower other people who are disempowered in a different way? In other words, a disempowered teacher may be able to empower a student in a different context. And I think what Janet is saying is there are issues on which one can make quite small steps, but there are also issues one can make the beginning of quite large steps by becoming involved in various kinds of collective action. And one of the things we've seen, not only in the last month, which will be picked up by a later question, but for the last dozens or so years, the use, for example, of new media, which make it much more possible for people, the most disempowered people, working at the most grassroots level, to have an impact they couldn't have done before. So I think there are mechanisms by which empowerment can come, which I think weren't available before. But even before this, the new media, there's a general principle that people who are disempowered are not necessarily always disempowered, and often a single event in their own lives that can make them feel 2 things. One is, I care enough to do something about it. I'm angry, and I can do something about it. And that doesn't have to be necessarily very large scale or very major. So I think that it's a little pessimistic to say that because teachers are disempowered, there can be no change that takes place within the school context. I think also I'd like to pick up the last phrase that no one's mentioned so far. However good the curriculum. Now, there's a kind of tension there, because in my observation, certainly perhaps more in Britain than here, is the curriculum generally in civic education quite often is very carefully not revolutionary, very carefully not rocking boats. And when in Britain our new citizenship education programme came in, the first session, I wrote various things which are saying basically this is unbelievably conservative and reactionary. and totally ridiculous as a civic engagement program. It then changed and got a bit better, but not much. But basically, the whole thing was designed to avoid any kind of ripples on the surface of the society. But I do think that when you actually have curricula which are designed to give students a voice in how they think about things, a voice in how they make their own decisions, even if they haven't got the power to enact it, the idea that students can have some kind of relationship to the ideas that they're holding, to what they're doing, to what they're thinking about, to how they're learning. I think that's a major change. Will you forgive me if I use your example from yesterday?
Please.
I had a marvelous conversation with Santiago yesterday. Santiago is a doctoral student here, and he was describing programs in Mexico where students are engaged in interactive learning and teaching with their teachers. It's very much grassroots learning and teaching. And children in very hierarchical schools, in a very hierarchical society, because they were engaged in a much more interactive and dialogic relationship of teaching and learning with their peers and with their teachers and with other people, were getting enormous empowerment very, very quickly through this process. Now, it was more empowerment in learning mathematics, but as Santiago was saying, it translates into other areas. Now, I was greatly excited by our conversation because I realised that, in fact, it does very much apply. However good the curricula, if the curricula are framed in such a way that give young people the opportunity, even at this micro level in the classroom, to start thinking about how can I really, take some agency in my learning, this could be the first step. So the curricula do make a difference. If our curricula permits empowerment even at this micro level, I think the fact that teachers are underpaid and oppressed and generally disregarded doesn't necessarily terminate the possibility of civic engagement.
Okay. So just I had a feeling you might want to respond to that, Mira, but maybe not.
I think for timing.
Okay, for timing is we will. Okay, but let's come back to this. I think it does raise the question of how would you empower teachers, and there are lots of different ways to think about that. So, okay, thank you. Let's go on to question number 3, and this question is for Fernando and Judith, and then for Mira again. And the question is that given that everyone agrees that we should be doing more research on global civic education, how do we educate young people to see themselves as actors on world issues? What should be the main themes of this? Fernando.
So the premise is I think we should be doing more global education because everybody's life is very affected by all kinds of global interdependencies. Now, I do think that we need research to support that education, but it's a kind of research we used to call research and development or curriculum development. It isn't just studying what it is the kids know or do not know. It's designing both the curriculum and the approaches and then doing the formative evaluation and the impact evaluation to figure out what impact do they have in both producing knowledge about global affairs, and I'm going to suggest what that knowledge should be. Some of you may surprise you. And also an efficacious engagement, which is not the intention to act, but strategic and effective engagement. Let me give you an example of what I mean by effectiveness. When the earthquake happened in Haiti, there were tons of people who volunteered to get themselves in that situation. And that isn't always helpful. And what is helpful, the main relief organizations are 10 organizations, and what is helpful is to get some coordination. The group of volunteers that get themselves lost in a place when everybody's trying to help the victims actually causes more harm than good. So efficacious is being able to think strategically about what is the best way to be effective in a situation of humanitarian need. And I think that the kind of knowledge that we need about how to produce that knowledge and that efficacious engagement is knowledge about how to support a global infrastructure that promotes peace and development. Now, that doesn't just mean the UN. It includes the UN and humanitarian agencies. It includes also multinationals. The single organization that has done most, in my mind, to advance women's rights in the Middle East are multinational corporations that have set specific quotas to have gender parity in employment at all kinds of levels of the organizations. What that means is that it's very important for people who are going to be involved with multinationals to have, in this case, the commitment to basic human rights to really advocate and act to advance, in this particular context, the rights of women. So what do we need to have a global infrastructure that is more capable, and therefore, how should that inform the kind of programs that we need to design and evaluate? Well, we certainly need more people who will support that infrastructure, just sheer numbers, more citizens. We also need more people who commit to work in those organizations, whether they are multinationals or whether they are social entrepreneurs or whether they are people who work in international development. And they need to both be capable and they also need to be capable of ethical reasoning and action. And I'll give you in a moment an example of how this is so critical. And lastly, we need good leadership in those institutions. And so the kind of programs that we need to be designing are programs that would produce the knowledge so that people are generally more supportive and interested in building a global infrastructure that advances peace and development, that produce more people who engage on the task, and leaders who are capable of leading. Let me say a word about the knowledge domains, which I think are important here. And I would agree with Judy that attitudes and engagement are important, but so is knowledge. We should not underestimate that. One of the things we're learning from the third study of Civic is that in some regions of the world, and for the world as a whole, knowledge is flat or has gone down. And it's very difficult to get people to be active democratic citizens if they don't understand what democracy is. And if they can't tell the difference between a place where you have certain rule of laws and balance of powers and a place where the ruler decides to fire everybody in Congress and appoint his friends so that he can reelect himself indefinitely. So I think knowledge is really very, very important. In addition, of course, to motivation and the traditional things. So what are the knowledge domains? One domain, which we don't often think as a civic domain, is economics. We need to prepare people to understand what are some of the main economic risks. And these are the risks associated with the volatility of the price of food, the risks associated with the spikes in the prices of oil, the risks associated with the major collapse of big economies, say like the United States economy in the world, or with the slowing down of the Chinese economy, or the impact of fiscal crisis, or the collapse in the prices of assets. So that's one big domain. Yeah. People need to just understand global economies. Yeah. Second, we need to have more generalized understanding of geopolitical risks. So an obvious one is international terrorism, but nuclear proliferation is another one, or the risks associated with particular countries in the world, say instability in Afghanistan, or North Korea, developments in North Korea, or the Israel-Palestine conflict. And this should be part of the commons that we have to build. Third set of risks are environmental risks. Risks associated with extreme weather, desertification, scarcity of water, and so on. Fourth domain are societal risks, pandemics, health epidemics, and lastly, technological risks associated with the breakdown of infrastructure and so on. Let me conclude giving you an example of how it is so important to prepare people who can both be competent but also act ethically. So one of the major consulting firm that implements US-funded development programs, and certainly the main actor in Pakistan. It's been around for 60 years. They've employed tons of my graduates. By and large, they've done a lot of good work. Recently, after the earthquake in Pakistan, we received a lot of money from US taxpayers. And they didn't follow the regular processes, which are to get 3 bids for independent contractors. They got 3 bids from people who were all relatives of each other. And the U.S. government found out and decided they would be punished. For a year and a half, they didn't get any money. The board of directors got together and said, you know what, we've got to close this firm. And I look at something like that and I wonder, did the person who did this thing and those who were responsible for the oversight anticipate the consequences that this inappropriate behavior would have for Pakistan's stability, for the U.S. ability to be helpful in that context, for the thousands of people who are going to lose their jobs working in this domain? And I think that particular domain, the capacity to prepare professionals that think ethically, is one Helen and I were talking about yesterday, about the need for us in universities to look at what they do. And when do we prepare our students to think about the ethics of their performance as professionals? Because, thank goodness this is not the case, but the person who made that mistake in Pakistan could have been one of my graduates, right? Who thought that he could take a shortcut or she could take a shortcut and get these 3 quick beats. And the consequence of that is that a good organization is gone. So anyway, I've talked too much, but I think in general we need to do these 3 things. Increase the supply of people who are interested in global development, the number of people who work in them, and the people who can lead.
Great. Thank you very much. Judith, you're next. I'm going to ask everybody to stay within 3 minutes, just because we have to keep moving here.
And I think you and I are not as far apart as we think on the importance of knowledge, because I think we need to know more about I think we do need more research, and we need to know what the major misconceptions are that young people have about the world, and there are lots of them. And two programs I'd like to very briefly mention, which I think try to deal with this. One is a unit we're putting in human development classes at the University of Maryland about what it meant for adolescents to be in growing up in Eastern Europe at the time of the transitions. We have a 6-hour program where we learn, for example, that we give examples from Romania, Estonia, and former Yugoslavia, along with the help of a Serbian graduate student who's a big help for us. Well, one of the students said to her, because we studied Estonia, well, do you think in Estonian, not realizing that Serbia and Estonia were different countries. So we have a lot of major misconceptions. And the other is, I thought you might be going to mention the Model UN, and I want to talk just a little bit about a project in Maryland that's been underway for 25 years, which Tony also knows about, called the ICONS Computer Assisted International Simulation, in which students still in 25 years, they've been doing this, are using networks to role-play diplomats from different countries and make decisions about issues like nuclear proliferation and other sorts of things. And as a matter of fact, the students get a real sense that they do misunderstand things, and that these misunderstandings can lead them to say things that make them look foolish, or that make other countries take advantage of the country they're playing, because there are some real stakes here. I mean, it isn't just we have to regurgitate this on an exam. It's a real sort of set.
Great. Thank you very much. Mira.
So I was thinking about the ways in which we are often reactively educating as opposed to proactively educating. What languages we think people should be learning, what regions they should be learning about, what we include in our history curricula or our literature curricula, tend to be in reaction to whatever happened, yesterday or last year or 10 years ago. And so, for example, I assume that many, many more schools now, although many, many fewer than one would like, presumably now have something in their curriculum about Islam. And potentially, a few even have something in their curriculum about world religions in this country. And that's really important, I think. But who knows if it's actually going to be so important 5 years from now or 10 years from now. It might be, or it may well not be. I mean, it may be that some other world religion is really important. It may be that some other part of the country, other part of the world is really important. I mean, none of us knows, right? And so I think that if we could help orient schools and curriculum writers and textbook writers and so forth towards thinking, towards understanding that whatever content we teach students has to be less fixed and more, that we are really teaching students to become actors in a fluid world whose shape and whose demands we have no ability to predict. And then think about what kinds of competencies we can predict students will need to have. Multilingualism, multiculturalism, an ability to take multiple perspectives, to recognize that when somebody says something who comes from a different cultural, historical, geographical, religious, linguistic background from them, that it's worth their time to stop and listen and to try to figure out what they're saying and to try to build bridges, as opposed to assuming that they are wrong or ignorant or whatever. I think that would be huge, and that actually partly is about building connections, helping young people build connections with people in other countries and learn about other countries, which now is so easy. I mean, for any classroom that has access to the internet or to cell phones, there's so many opportunities. But also actually changing how we treat students and teach about students here in the United States. Demonstrating respect for students who are bilingual or multilingual, as opposed to trying to enforce monolingualism on them, would be huge. I mean, it would transform how we present the virtues versus the vices of multilingualism and multiculturalism. truly, I mean, we are an international country in many ways, and our schools are often very international. And if they actually represented that in a positive light and drew upon those as strengths as opposed to trying to deal with them as weaknesses, I think that would go a long way. Not the whole way, but it would go a long way towards helping students develop the kinds of competencies and attitudes that will also foster globalism and global collaboration, which is the kind of
I can't resist comments. I mean this well, but I think you may need to go out to some areas of Illinois or Nebraska or some parts of this country and see what may be taught about Islam.
Oh, I'm not saying that we're doing a good job.
The misconceptions
right. No.
And even virulent prejudice, which does not try to take, and if they are trying, in many cases, to take a local perspective, it's a perspective of our perspective is better. If we understand this, then maybe we can convert them to another point of view. I think because...
You agree with that?
Yes.
I agree with that. Okay, we're going to have to move on. This question is for Janet, Bob, and Fernando. And the question is, tens of thousands of young people in the Middle East recently acted as exemplary democratic citizens, even though they probably had very poor civic education. What does that mean for civic education in countries like the U.S.? Janet, you want to start?
Thanks. I think that two main points for this situation that's continuing to unfold stood out for me. The first is to recognize the emergency that is important for civic action, and then the other one is to see it happening for yourself or for your own group. So for the first point, a name that we should all know, if not already, is Mohamed Bouazizi, and he's the shopkeeper in Tunisia who immolated himself in December, and this set off the Tunisian revolution. So what happened was that he was sick of not sick, that's not a good way to put it. He had suffered a lot of indignities from a local municipal officer who, they'd been tormenting him for a while, and then they stole from him. And some other things have been going on, and then he set himself on fire. So because of this act, then, along with a lot of other factors that have been happening for a long time, then there's the Tunisian revolution, and then Egypt, and then Libya. So I think we should remember his name, because it's this single act that caused people to recognize the serious crisis and emergency that had been happening to them and to the country for a long time. So it's not like this suddenly happened, but that they suddenly realized that something had to be done, that now it's intolerable. Like now life cannot continue as usual, that this is absolutely terrible. And I think that that's why elections are very powerful for people in all countries, especially in the US, that elections become an emergency because you see where your civic engagement and your civic actions are going. You have like an end sight, a point, you understand your goal, which is, I think, much more concrete and easier to get a grip on than some ongoing kind of civic involvement where you're unsure about what the outcome is or what your efforts are amounting to. And the other thing about seeing it as possible is, when there's revolutions going on, then I think people feel like they're empowered to do it because they understand it's possible, even in impossible circumstances, especially under oppressive regimes, where it's greatly encouraging to see not only others in the same situation going through this enormous act of taking action, but also the support from around the world. So I think one way to think about it is Roger Bannister, who ran the 4-minute mile. He's the first one to do it. And, it had never been done before in history. This was considered legend. And it was legend. It's true. Wikipedia. So he runs the 4-minute mile, and it's amazing. But within 2 years, a bunch of other people broke the record. So it's not like suddenly people had developed new ways of working out or, everyone's taking some kind of supplement. It's that, people realize that it's unclear what happened, but people realize that it was possible and that they recognize that this is an outcome that's accessible to them. And I see that as parallel to this discussion of civic engagement.
Thank you, Janet. Bob?
Yeah, well, I'd like to take a contrarian view to that.
About Bannister or about...
I knew Roger Bannister. Who was the second person to break the 4-minute barrier?
Exactly.
You're an Aussie. I want to say not much to what does this mean for civic education, and then I'll try to tell you why I'm saying that. First, I want to tell you a story, a short story. very short. So we got funded to do an evaluation of facing history ourselves. I don't know how many of you are aware of this organization, but it basically uses case studies to try, and a pedagogy that tries to integrate historical understanding, the knowledge piece, ethical reflection, and civic engagement or civic understanding in a kind of integrated, beautifully woven curricular piece. And by and large, they do an okay job of this. So we got funded to evaluate them, and meant we needed to develop measures. And but the story I want to tell you is about going before the board of the foundation that that funded us, and they said, and they were a kind of a pro-facing history a family foundation. And they said to us, Bob, the impact of facing history will be demonstrated when we see that kids who take facing history will populate and propagate the mayors, the politicians, the governors of this country. That was their outcome measure. Okay, that was what they had hoped for to demonstrate. Right? This is a 3-year study. But aside from that, it gives you a sense of the aspirations that people have when they start to talk about civic engagement. Now, what does that have to do with this question, other than I just wanted to tell you that story? It's something like this. It's that, following up on what Mira said, I sat glued to the television or the computer or whatever it is while during the Egyptian experience, and I doubt whether people are staying glued to the Libyan experience as much. So what's the takeaway from that with respect to this question? And I would say that civic education and engagement is a lifelong process. It's not something that you pick up in a couple of minutes and transform yourself. And I feel like the first, and so I think John Kenneth Galbraith also once said, humility is a very overvalued virtue. But you'd have to know Galbraith to understand why that was funny. But the truth is, if you're a social scientist, I think one ought to be very humble in thinking about this particular question. I think that the first line of understanding, I believe, is what we can learn from this, not whether we're going to transform ourselves. And I think the first line of good understanding would be the journalists. I have not seen any good journalism yet understanding what the people were thinking, what they were not thinking when this was going on. I think that's essential from an educational point of view, is you have to understand the meaning of these events for people. And I don't have a clue. And I think it would be great if people in the audience who may be closer to this than we are could share with us what you think this means for both the folks over there and the folks here. But the point I'm really trying to make is that meaning gets built up over time. And actions, and to pick up on what Janet said, and not be quite so cynical and skeptical, the actions that one hears and understands early in life keep getting reworked. And when they get reworked in a meaningful way over time, that's when there's more likely to have an impact, and maybe we will have more mayors who are not going to be arrested, and and more governors who are going to be pro-social.
Great. Fernando.
I think there are two direct implications, and maybe one were unannounced. The direct implications are, one, we should learn from the events in the Middle East that it's probably not a good idea to exclude a large proportion of the population from the opportunities to participate meaningfully in the economy or in politics. It's hard to have political stability, and it's especially hard to have democracy under those circumstances. So we all should do some introspection about the very large percentage of people in our own society who are excluded from exactly the same opportunities, because I do think that has consequences for the health of this democracy. The second implication, it really is a great research opportunity for those who are interested in civic education, is to try to see how many of our high school students, college professors, can
place the countries on the map, understand what the implications of these events are for regional affairs, but also for us. Have the capacity to play out different scenarios looking forward. Because I do think that those events are consequential for all of us, really. Not just in terms of the impact they're going to have on oil and so on. Now, what I don't think we can draw is the easy inference that maybe because the kids who were demonstrating in Tahrir Square had not received a great civic education, this suggests that civic education is not all that helpful. And the reason I don't think we should draw that inference is, first of all, we don't know, I don't know, what kind of civic education those kids had received. We certainly know that in Egypt and in most of the countries of the Middle East, there is a very large bulge of the young population with all kinds of levels of education, including college graduates, who have found it very difficult to find jobs and who, as a result, spend many years waiting for jobs and who, as a consequence of that, find it very difficult to make the transition to adulthood. So I imagine that some of those college graduates had great organizational skills to organize these demonstrations and so on. I also know that there are programs in the region. I know that because I'm evaluating one of them, that even though they don't have the name of civic education programs, these are programs to develop entrepreneurship, are in effect programs to develop leadership and the capacity for students to take themselves seriously historically, to borrow facing history's language, and to become historical actors. Now, I also think that we should go beyond the superficial interpretation of what is happening in the Middle East that says, oh, this is an example of how Facebook brings about democracy. Facebook and the youth bring about democracy because there are other political actors that are very important. The military, for example, in that region. The military in Egypt that left Mubarak without options but resigning, and who hasn't done the same thing in Libya, is very, very important. We don't know what would happen in one of these regimes if the military actually decide to go out and massacre people, commit genocide in a region. So I think that this is a fascinating set of events. We don't know yet whether the kinds of civic competencies that these young people have displayed to cause trouble will in the end help them create the institutions that would allow effective governance. And we certainly know enough about political transitions, think about South Africa, to understand that democratic transitions will not necessarily immediately lead to well-functioning democratic institutions that deliver education and health for the people and so on. So I certainly hope they have those skills, because I think that their populations and the rest of the world would be better off for it. But I'm agnostic as to whether they have them or not. I just say that there's a whole lot that we don't know about civic education and what's happening in the Middle East.
Great. Let me get to what will probably be our last question, because we really want to hear your questions and for you to engage the panelists. It's a question for Peter and for Bob and for Judith, and the question is, what reforms in policy do we need to enhance youth civic engagement?
I'll start because I have a sentence.
Go ahead, Bob.
I think we should relook at our educational system a little bit and start civic engagement in kindergarten, primarily with the capacity to have discussions and listen to other people. And that is going to require a rethinking of current educational policies. I was shocked by a finding that recently someone shared with me. I have been doing moral education for 40 years and advocating for discussion in classrooms, and the evidence is that in public schools in the United States, 2% of classroom time is discussion. So my takeaway, that I have been talking to myself and to my colleagues in academia for 40 years. And so, that.
Is that across grades?
Yeah, and it's even including social studies and history. Social studies and history goes up to 3%. But that's the finding. Pretty good empirical studies. A little bit upsetting to your typical social scientist.
Peter, can you lift us out of?
Well, no. I mean, I think the policy question is difficult. I think it's not as hard to say. I mean, I wouldn't come and tell you all, but I think we could say what good teaching looks like, and it would include, for example, discussing current events, including controversial current events. And a lot of people get told that in education schools and elsewhere. Much harder to see what the policy levers are that really work. And I'll just share two reasons that I'm actually, unfortunately, going to keep us in this bond. Because one is we did a study, the Knight Foundation surveyed 100,000 young people with a set of questions about their knowledge of certain, and also attitudes and values in certain domains of the civic. They were interested in news. And so we were able to use those data to try to see whether state policies matter. And state policies vary a lot. There are states with required high school civics classes. There are states with high-stakes civics graduation tests. Maryland has 75 hours of community service learning, and some other big state systems. For example, Chicago that has that, so that would show up in the Illinois results. And there were no effects at all. Likewise, you would think that No Child Left Behind would be this big experiment that would affect the curriculum at the elementary level, especially in the middle school level, causing civics, for example, to lose its time allocation in the classrooms. And lots of people believe that that's happened retrospectively, that they've lost time allocation. But when you look at the actual year-by-year time allocations as reported by teachers, there's no effect. So you have this gigantic change and no effect. And the 2 or 3% of time being spent is something that seems to be impervious. So I don't think we should expect that we can have some kind of slam dunk success by any particular policy intervention. I think partly it has to do that the issue is very much about quality rather than just quantity, and so the inputs that you have to sort of constantly work on, not just having a test, but having a good test, and not just having a professional development requirement, but having a good professional development. So quality is very important. I just want to plug a couple things, though, and one is I think the federal government could invest more in better evaluation of civics that would have stakes, but that would be better quality, including things like simulations and so on. And the second thing is that right now, today, probably at midnight, the Senate will vote on, or after midnight, because I think the rule prevents them from voting until midnight, will vote on a set of budgetary choice, basically, between the Senate bill and the House bill, one of which has $35 million in it for competitive funding for civic education, which would drive innovation, the other which has $0 for civic education. So I hope they pass the Senate bill, and Senator Brad has not. This is one of about 6 senators who's not said which way he's voting. So if you can send him an email, that would be very helpful. I have done so.
Judith.
Very quickly, our study of the 140,000 students in 28 countries also, when we just took the U.S. data, which is about 3,000 national representative students, the state policies didn't make any difference there either. And we used several rating systems to look. And we had the rating systems for the curriculum in place at the time the test was taken. Same result. I'd like to just say very quickly a couple of things. In the first place, I think we too often, I think senators are terrifically important, and this is a terrifically important bill. I note the word competitive funding, because in the past this funding was not competitive. But the point is that there are more people with policy levers than that. So we mentioned multinational corporations that my daughter's not teaching in business school, and I'm struck many times by the fact that we have a lot of common interests and a lot of ways of looking at what motivates people, what other things, and we tend to say, oh, that's the business school over there. There's very often some interesting ideas might come from there and might end up being from the private sector. That's one. Others, I think we pay far too little attention to journalists. Right. There used to be actually a great book called The Newsroom Guide to Polls and Surveys, which tried very hard to help journalists at least interpret test results or these things properly. It's gone out of print a long time ago. And it's too bad because in many ways journalists, I think, shaped this. And the other is leaders of a variety of community organizations who are advocates for children, for civic education, for other things. They're not literally, they don't have the policy levers in their hand, but in many cases they have the opportunities to shape those sorts of things. And finally, I think researchers could do a better job in presenting our results. I do a lot of international research, and I get so annoyed with the TIMSS rankings every. Where do we rank? Trends in International Mathematics and Science, the ones that always do end up in the middle to the bottom. usually with a different set of countries, and usually the kind of test that nobody really understands. I think we have to be much more transparent about what we say to students. That's why I started doing cluster analysis, which says, 8% of students in the United States and all the developed countries are really alienated from politics. Now that makes sense to somebody, rather than our mean is 1/3 of the standard deviation, greater, less, or our regression. I mean, those are interesting. I do them all the time, but I think we have to find some better ways of presenting things that will actually remind policymakers that civic education makes a difference. Remember those kids hanging out in the corner in your town, and they really want a project, but they can't, find anything to do except things that are illegal. It would be nice if they had some other opportunities.
Great. So, two things. One is, Mira, you were very generous, did a rare thing. You gave up some airtime on this question of teacher empowerment. And if you would like to say a few words about that, you should. This is a good time to do that.
I cannot say that it's been, eating at me.
Okay.
So my time.
So I would say two things. That interestingly, basically, what Janet said and what Helen said went in two different directions, both of which I think are thoughtful and important. One was, so basically Janet said, let's think about what one can do at the micro level, that, there's always some domain in which you can exercise power. And so let's, even if that's solely within the classroom or within the school or within a club, think about sort of that exercise. And then Helen's response was sort of the reverse, which was, okay, so in some contexts you may be disempowered, but you can look outside that context and find one in which you can gain power and exercise power. And I thought both of those were really right and thought-provoking. And I should say I was not meaning to suggest that it is inevitable that no teacher can, actually engage in good civic education. So, I think it's hard, but that thinking about both the micro and the, sort of thinking about the contextual, right, and in what contexts, what might both teachers and students feel as if they could make a difference, is very important. The other thing that Helen didn't say explicitly, which I was expecting her to initially in her response, was to say, when she asked, well, what actually gets people engaged, it's not that because I, as a teacher, have engagement, I can then transfer my engagement onto you. I thought that we were going to talk about these sort of motivation and these triggering things, and what's important, in fact, in that respect, is not that I have engagement that then I can transfer, but that kids feel excited and as if something's really meaningful to them. And then the question is, how can we go from meaning to action? Mm-hmm. And it is possible. I mean, I would again agree that it's possible that if teachers are sort of open to it, that they can help students make that transition from finding meaning in something to action. Regardless of how oppressed they feel by the heavy hand of the state.
Yeah, I think I am fussing about it. That's part of the reason I want to come back to the question, because we have a terrible teacher retention problem in this country. I mean, half of teachers are leaving after 5 years. I think this is in part a disempowerment issue, and that these opportunities for teachers to be entrepreneurial, to take on leadership positions, to get engaged with the community are all very important for many reasons, including keeping good teachers in the profession. So, does anybody have any burning responses to something somebody else said on the panel that they want to? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, something very quickly on kind of policy levers. We should be asking about the civic responsibility of the university with regards to these issues. Because it seems to me the last time in this country that universities played a really constructive role in improving K-12 education was 50 years ago after Sputnik. And I think going back to a point you made earlier, Mira, which is how can teachers who are disempowered empower anybody? I think as institutions we should face the question of what is our social responsibility vis-a-vis education systems that are crumbling, where we know that the conversation is going to be about which teachers are going to be fired in the next 5 years, where we know that we have a terrible
fiscal crisis that is going to impact the schools, as a result of which kids in the places that most need teachers are going to end up in classrooms with 30 or 40 kids. So I think we should be really all asking ourselves, how do we spend our time? And how do we, at the very least, have a coherent theory of action of what our own obligation is? Because I don't think it is acceptable, given this situation, to say, well, I'm just going to contemplate how the Titanic falls out. So.
Great. Well, thank you, everybody. This was great. And I wanted to open it up now to you, to everyone in the audience, for any questions that you have. Or comments, yeah.
So I was wondering, and I would like to know what people think of.
Yeah, please introduce yourselves. Yeah.
My name is Blake. I'm in Prevention Science and Practice. I'm a master's student.
Great.
So I was wondering what people might think about civic engagement or civic education in regards to the immigration situation. So on one hand, I lived in the city of Chicago. 700,000 people marched a few years ago. I mean, it shut down all the downtown of the city. On the other hand, in my experience working with students, they know very little about it. I mean, for them, for the most part, for instance, immigration is about Mexicans. It's not about Latinos. It's not about anybody else in the world. So I was just wondering, using that issue, how do you guys see civic engagement and civic education playing out?
Great question. Panelists, anyone have thoughts about this?
Panelists or others?
Or others?
Yeah.
Well, there actually, in the book, there's a great article by Hindasat about especially undocumented markets. Having also lived in Chicago and having lived in Johnson in Chicago, and so I know some of these things. And this experience was for me a very important shaping experience. And I think it's one of the examples, perhaps in some ways, of what Janet talked about when she talked about small things in the place where you are. I'm not sure it's exactly, but it's the framing that I'm using in some of the things I'm doing now is the developmental niche the individual is in, rather than getting them to think about, electing the senator or whatever. What's going on where I am? Is there something that I need to know about? And sometimes that can happen across ethnic lines. It doesn't always, but sometimes it can. I think that some of the northern countries now, particularly, trying to face the issue of how they are going to teach students and adults, for that matter, about immigration, because there's been such a wave of anti-immigrant now represented in the parliament. So I think this is an area where we need the kind of design and research that we talked about, action research, whatever you want to call it, that tries to look at ways of making changes and evaluating it at the same time, not just saying we made the changes.
Bob, you want to respond, and then Fernando?
Yeah, I mean, we threw questions into the hopper for this panel, and some didn't make it. One of mine was kicked out because it was too boring. It was, what does your discipline have to say about civic engagement? And the reason I wanted it in there was because alone these disciplines have very little to say about these kind of questions. But I'm going to make a comment which is very little to say, which is that some of us tend to look at social structures and ask how can the social structures sustain kind of engagement. Others of us look at human nature and say, what is it in human nature that keeps us sustaining this? And I think I think the issues around 700,000 marchers, it was a one-off event, and that's not sustainable. And so how do you sustain, so I would turn it around. I don't have an answer. How do you take a social injustice, if that's what you think this is, and maintain a kind of civic engagement in this process, something that we hope will continue to happen in Egypt, for example. We don't have much hope is going to happen in Libya. I don't have an answer. That's what I think.
It's a great question. Speaking of Chicago, I've been helping DePaul University rethink their liberal arts curriculum with regards to the development of civic and personal responsibility. And DePaul University is a true example for all of us, especially for these universities,
of how it is that you develop a coherent, intentional curriculum to promote civic engagement. And students in that place actually have in their second year, the Chicago experience, they have to go out into communities and discover kind of Chicago and figure out how does that connect with them. In contrast to what, so I would say that's a good example of what it means for an institution to take on the development of responsibility and provide students the opportunities to think about immigration, and their own opportunities to make a difference, to include this group and so on. In contrast, I will tell you that this very morning in this university, in one of the university committees I serve, we're planning an activity, and I suggested that in that activity we should invite one of our undocumented students just to bring, of which we have some extremely bright students, and I think they give us a great opportunity to educate the rest of the community on the potential that is there. And I can tell you this was a controversial subject among a faculty discussion as to whether we should do this or not. So to me this is very indicative of the importance of having good leadership and coherent missions that align an institution, that really help the institution take a moral stance. And sadly, not all of our universities have a clear, well-aligned moral stance with regards to immigration, for example, or similar topics. So.
Yeah. Scott.
Just something.
You introduce yourself, Scott?
Oh, sorry. My name is Scott Sider. I'm an assistant professor at Boston University. Just something Dr. Reamer said just resonated with something I've been thinking about, which is that I do think, you mentioned DePaul University, which is a Catholic university. I don't know which denomination.
Vincentian, St. Vincent de Paul.
And I was thinking that at both the K-12 level and at the university level, I feel like we have an enormous amount to learn from Catholic universities in particular, who've been sort of doing this work for a long time. And on one level, structurally, they have an enormous advantage in that they can sort of be unabashedly ideological. Right? They can sort of say, this is what we stand for, and, come if you want, join us if you want. But, and I think that's sort of worth, kind of thinking about, are there sort of civic ideologies that secular universities can buy into? But I think sort of on the flip side, I also think that history of having sort of a clear ideology has allowed them to put, various structures in place, that they know work. And I think that it's quite worthwhile for both K-12 public schools and secular private universities and public universities to look towards these Catholic universities.
It's no coincidence that Jim Eunice, who was one of the authors,
right,
a major figure who not only taught at Catholic University until he retired, but also wrote books about Catholic University.
Yeah.
And actually, for that matter, his book on community service and social responsibility in youth, which is a parochial, looking at parochial school, I think has a lot of lessons for K-12 public schools.
Right. Other questions and comments? Yeah, go ahead.
My question is sort of related to this, and it just seems to me that...
Introduce yourself.
Yes, sir.
My name is Miriam. I actually work for the New Teacher Project, and I have a Harvard Family Gym membership. It just seems to me that a lot of the discussion about civic engagement is really value-laden. So from a teacher's perspective, is there a way to teach civic engagement, which seems very odd to say, without value preferencing? Because I think that's something that holds teachers back. And the other part of my question is, I tend not to think about teachers as disempowered in this perspective. I want to think that teachers are actually arms of a ideological state apparatus, and they have an interest in creating a school environment that's disciplinary and not open to engagement. And so how is the school itself, the question is, how is the school itself structured so that teachers don't have an investment in civic engagement or teaching oppositional civic engagement amongst their students? So that's the other thing.
No, these are great thoughts. Sorry, you want to say something else? Yeah.
Can I say something provocative to you? All knowledge is value-laden, even in physics, one way or another. We cannot have value-free knowledge. We cannot have value-free education. What we can have is a reflective awareness of where we're coming from in our values, and a reflective awareness and appreciation of where other people are coming from, and a way of discussing and working around that. So making our values explicit is what we can do in science, and social science, and education, and humanities. But I think it's extremely dangerous to pretend that we can be value-free, because we are deluding ourselves, and the consequences can be quite disastrous. So that's a very important point.
We'll get to your question.
This is a problem for K-12 teachers who are operating in the public interest, or
it's a problem, but the problem we as educators have to face. That if we tell people that it's like it's almost equivalent to saying to kids, well, you know, as you're growing up through puberty, forget this sex stuff, you know, ignore it, you know, wait till you're 25 years old and married. I mean, you know how well that works, you know. Values are there, and we have to find ways of dealing with them effectively in education in our lives, and denying them or ignoring them, pretending to away from this is not going to be very helpful. But yes, let's richly appreciate values, let's richly explore values, let's discuss values. But let's not deny them.
There are a bunch of hands up. Mira, I think your hand was up, and Peter, you had something to say too, and then there was a question back. Yeah.
So I think both of those are really important questions. So tie it, say, into the immigration question. So you can think of a continuum, right? I mean, when I was hearing your question about immigration, I was thinking, all right, so it's the question about teaching immigrant students and how to help them be empowered individuals, and what it means, say, for those who aren't citizens, to help them see sort of capacities for civic action. Is it about teaching about immigration, right, and the effects of immigration on this country? Is it about teaching kids who are immigrants and non-immigrants, you know, together, or who are immigrants from different places who have different immigrant stories, right, and how we built. And so, you know, there can be very basic stuff that one can do that's not particularly value-laden. I mean, has some value valence, but, you know, say expanding beyond just teaching about the importance of voting, which is great unless you're not a citizen, in which case you don't get to, right? And sort of thinking about a wider set of civic actions and civic capacities that one has. That seems pretty, you know, all teachers could basically do that. Moving a step, thinking about what if kids, say, are motivated to do something about immigration, right? They get excited about the DREAM Act, and they want to do something about the DREAM Act. Well, can you sort of structure apparently neutral, you know, structures through which kids can get involved? Well, what if in fact all your kids are on one side of the DREAM Act? Or what if there's a pretty strict divide, right, in your classroom, and there's some kids who are on one side and some kids on the other, but they're demographically pretty identifiable, and they start, you know, accusing each other. It's a very difficult and dangerous thing. I think that if we had more respect and more support for teachers' capacities for the importance of allowing space for kids to think things through, and to understand that when a kid says something or does something that's provocative or political, that it doesn't necessarily mean that the teacher is being ideological and partisan. That would be great, but it's very dangerous. I mean, you know, there's a case of a teacher who was fired in Colorado for answering a kid's question in response to a Scholastic News article or Time Newsweek or something. It was a fifth grader who said, you know, to her teacher, well, what do you feel about the war in Iraq? And she said, oh, I honk when I see, you know, the honk for peace. And she got fired. And the courts upheld it, right? I mean, this wasn't just some rogue administrator, right? We have court precedent now supporting the idea that the teacher, as an employee of the state, can be sanctioned for engaging in that kind of apparently partisan interaction. So I think it is very hard. To the second question, very briefly about sort of school culture. I think that what we see is a vicious cycle, right? I mean, so if teachers, I think, are feeling disempowered, and one of the only ways in which they can exercise power and are judged to be powerful and effective is through exercising control over kids, then that's what they will do. And then there is greater reward for control and also greater cost when controls are released, because kids haven't had practice with what to do when there aren't these controls tamping down on them. So I think there are models, clearly, that are quite different, but they're hard as a policy matter to proliferate.
Yeah, well, it's a great question, obviously. That's why we're all excited to weigh in on it. And I agree with what both other folks have said. But I think I can add something to that. You know, I think Helen's obviously right that neutrality itself is just sort of a distraction, because it doesn't exist epistemologically, and also from a practical point of view, you know, institutions are not neutral. They're set up. They have the same high school that might be trying to be politically neutral in a way also has a football team and a glee club and, you know, all that. So, but I think there is a set of choices, though, that teachers really can and do make, which which are not about neutrality versus not, but they are about things like, I mean, there's a virtue, an ethic of open-endedness, where one has a discussion and doesn't control the outcome. And I'm not sure that's the cardinal or primary virtue. I mean, going back to Jim Lewis's work on Catholic schools, I mean, one of the findings there is that, you know, in that particular school, which I don't really know what it is, you know, the African American Protestant kids exposed to white, mostly, I guess they're mixed race, highly Catholic teachers don't end up being Catholic and don't end up having other views, but are sort of moved by the stimulus of commitment on the part of the teachers. So it's not clear to me that open-endedness is the preeminent value, but I do think it is something that one can strive for if one chooses to, and certainly I think college teachers should. And there are a set of other virtues that are sort of like that, in that they're not neutrality, but they're things like respect for discursive respect, you know, respect for different points of view. Although there are again limits, there are certainly some views that shouldn't be respected and that very few teachers would actually respect. So I think that's the terrain we're dealing with. And then there's a second, Mira put on the table a second, there's two layers, because the teacher's relation to the students is one of either, you know, indoctrination or open-endedness, but then of course the school's relation to the teacher is likewise.
Great. Another question or thought? Yeah.
Hi, Erhard Grape. I'm a researcher at Harvard Project Zero. So, in listening to some of the questions that were asked and the responses there, I was provoked to kind of recombine some of those questions when in thinking about the discussion that ensued. For instance, when we talked about the military's role in the Mideast revolutions, for instance, it played a very different role in Egypt than we see it playing now in Libya. And what we know about Egypt is that there's a compulsory military service imposed there. And so, what is the role of family in civic education when many of the fathers likely served in the military, and we can define a form of civic education as serving in the military? And so, I'm curious about the definition of civic education. And when we think about then interventions of a child's or a youth's civic engagement and civic education coming from outside the schoolyard, like that sources, the locus being family, the locus being community, what is the role of the school then that is most important in civic education? Is it critical thinking skills, media literacy, and other tools that these students might take into these other spheres that are really going to best prepare them to be more civically engaged and to get the most out of the civic education that is always beyond the schoolyard?
Another great question. Anybody in the panel or outside the panel want to take this one on?
Well, I think implicit in this conversation is civic education for democracy. So, I mean, I think that's, I'm not saying that's the only definition. I'm saying implicit, I suspect in this panel, is a form of agency among youth that will facilitate their understanding of our understanding of their understanding of our understanding of democracy and what it entails. And I think from that flows the policies. But the other thought I had with my question was slightly different, but maybe not so different, which was I'm naively, very naively, enthusiastic about some kind of universal public service for youth. I just am. I don't know why. I have no data. I can't rest this on much. Israelis have it. Swiss have it. I can't. It seems to be an important part of civic life. And it seems to me, my only argument would be philosophical, which would be people are living longer these days. They're wasting a lot of their time living longer. We don't have I would not speak for myself. I would, in this case, speak for the society. So why not invest some of that energy in some kind of evidence-based kind of civic participation in universal service?
Yeah.
An army or Yeah, sure.
Go ahead, Fernando.
It's a good question. I don't know.
But I think it's a very good question. I think in terms of a research agenda, it does make sense to look outside schools. Look at the military.
Yes.
Which I think in this country has a few things to teach colleges about how to promote racial integration, for example.
Military is the best educational
I
program
think it
in
does
the
make sense to look in this country. It used to be political parties that did political socialization until about 50 years ago. So I think in terms of research, it makes sense to be ecumenical as we look for effective mechanisms to develop particular knowledge and skills and pedagogies, and not assume that the range of variation we're going to find in our educational institutions is all there could be. And so,
Well, I don't disagree with that. Going back to your question, so I thought your point was okay. So you have a universal service in Egypt. Certainly, we're not going to make that as the unique causal event that helps us understand, but it's something you think is interesting and a factor. And then you're wondering, what is the effect of that kind of service on families' sense of civic engagement in the country and in the society? I think it's a very researchable question. I don't know the answer. That's why I said I only free associated to it, and with the belief that that kind of universal civic participation would be a good national policy. And I don't know, and somebody can tell me who studied this or experienced this or anything, why we don't have it. Or should we have it? Or is there an argument against it? Yeah.
I think there's a thought or question.
You have a question.
Thought, question, depends if someone wants to
No,
respond.
is it about this or is it about?
It connects to this.
Okay, great.
In Bob's saying that perhaps it's democracy that we are looking towards, but also goes back to whether teachers are empowered.
Introduce yourself.
Please.
Sorry. Vanessa Rodriguez. I'm a first-year doctoral student here, and I taught in New York City public schools for 11 years as a humanities teacher.
Thank you.
And I would argue that it is difficult for teachers who don't feel empowered. And kind of speaking to this issue of a democratic society, how democratic is a teacher under mayoral control? That's a dictatorship. And so that's not a democracy. And I also would push back on Helen, your comment about sometimes the most disempowered are the ones who demand social change. And when I look at what we teach our kids about some of the greatest revolutions in the United States, we can argue that the American Revolution was really pushed by businessmen who did not want to be taxed. We can argue that that slavery, we got rid of slavery because the North really wanted to eliminate the workforce of the South in the Civil War. And I would also push back on Janet's point of whether revolutions are really, they're not a single act. That's like saying that, the World War really was because of Archduke Ferdinand getting shot. They're long coming revolutions where many players are involved, and oftentimes a very empowered organization sets up the structure to then pull in the masses that are disempowered as a further support system. And in my mind, that's what we're seeing in Egypt. They often have to point out one single act to pull in the masses of the disempowered. Like Rosa Parks didn't want to sit down. We all know that it was not Rosa Parks, that solely created this revolution. And so for teachers, especially like in New York City, if you are eliminating their voice, and let's connect that to the union, though that's a whole other separate argument, but that's what society looks at as the voice of teachers. If the federal government themselves are being silenced and therefore empowering other groups to say, let's eliminate teacher voice by eliminating the unions, then really I would argue that it is extremely difficult for teachers who feel disempowered, who are losing their jobs and losing the ability to feed their own kids at home, to then teach civic engagement. To what extent are you asking us to sacrifice in order to do so?
Comments about this one? Yeah. Introduce yourself, please.
I'm Brendan Randall, a second-year doctoral student. And I think building on that, too, and picking up on Helen's comment, I think we tend to have an autonomistic liberal frame as presumed in the air we breathe. And that we tend to forget when we say autonomy, we are also qualifying it with autonomy for certain values we support. So I work, for example, my research involves conservative Christians who don't like pluralism. I'm not comfortable. I want to give those teachers autonomy as personal level classroom autonomy. So I think when I use like autonomy, I have to be careful because I'm conscious of all autonomy isn't universally good. I do have a sense of I want to empower certain teachers, but not others. And I think often what happens in American discourse is we reify these ideas like autonomy, liberty, without acknowledging that we often do have social value agendas. And what we're really saying is autonomy to pursue certain pedagogical goals we see as legitimate. And we need to make that express. So your concern for teachers in New York is because you think they'll use the autonomy in a certain way that you see as pedagogically valuable. But I think we have to be cautious to realize if we just use autonomy or empowerment as our language, we're going to open up, autonomy and empowerment. We didn't mean that autonomy and empowerment.
So if you were going to have a conversation with Mayor Bloomberg, right, and you presented that argument to him,
I'd be fired.
You've already flew the coop, so to speak. But if you were, what do you think his counter argument would be?
I think he would say he can't measure that effectively.
You can't measure.
How do you measure civic engagement, and how is that something that we should be investing money in? And how can you prove to me that somehow it is economically advantageous?
So if you showed him our measures and said, here's some good measures of it, would he change his mind?
Would Bloomberg change his mind?
Yeah.
I'm going to try to not laugh. I have an idea that Bloomberg would change his mind. I think he would again say, how is it economically advantageous? His purpose of schooling is how does it affect the economy? And is it an advantage to the economy overall? And so the measurement of a child being more democratically engaged and civically engaged, I don't think is his measure of success.
That's great. That's good.
Here, quickly, and we are out of time at 6 o'clock. So,
yeah. All right, so very quickly, the one sort of wrench I throw into those claims is that we know, we were talking about this in my class last week, we know above all else that education, that the years of education is strongly correlated with civic engagement. And so arguably, say, if the sole focus of an education system of a mayor is to reduce the dropout rates, improve high school graduation, say, that may have a more positive effect on young people's civic engagement and civic empowerment in the long term than anything that they actually do to promote civic engagement directly or civic education directly. So,
I'd like to just turn that around, though, and say that some of the sorts of empowering experiences which are described, you might make the kids want to stay in school.
Yes.
We have some
Right.
evidence from some analysis we did that that's actually the case, and then you have more graduates, and then you have
Right, but going back to Brendan's concern, if you are giving teachers, I mean, the thought is if you're giving all these incompetent teachers tons of autonomy, and they are having fun with projects, but not actually teaching kids what they need to know, say, the regents, you might keep them in school.
and just going back to Brendan's concern, I think that those of us who are concerned about the conservative agenda, if we don't create a language for talking about common values, then we're not going to persuade lots of Americans out there. They should think of something beyond criticism and skepticism, which I don't think really resonate with a lot of Americans out there.
Thanks,
So let me just, before closing, let me just urge everybody to go rob a bank so they can buy this book.
I'll tell you go to your university librarian, if you're not at Harvard, I presume you have it already, give them this and say, buy this book.
Yeah.
Or get it online, because then you can get a chapter at a time.
Let me thank all of you for coming, and let me thank our panelists, too.